Chapter 4. One of the greatest challenges of running something on the scale of a galaxy was dealing with the differences in time zones. The founders had tried almost everything to deal with the problem, and they had passed the issue on to the next generations to join. In the end, they had put together a systemized optimization that relied on flexibility and buffers to take into account as much as was deemed reasonably necessary. That was bureaucratic speak for a solution that only partly works. Ships containing an FTL drive could indeed manage to get to other systems, and far quicker than any other form of communication, but that was not instantaneous enough for something as massive as the Union. What had saved them was the discovery of the warp drive, or more accurately put, the discovery that it could be used for something. They had taken an archaic bit of technology deemed entirely useless and managed to turn it into the backbone of their governing structure. Typically bureaucratic in both form and execution. Warp jumping was a dangerous field of work, but it had been decided long ago that its risks were outweighed by its rewards. A profession that was almost as old as the Union itself, it had allowed information and communication that spanned hundreds of thousands of light years to be transmitted near instantaneously. As fantastic as this might seem at first glance, it became less impressive once one looked behind the curtain. It was done with such a low-tech level, it may as well have been written off if not for the results. It was a cruel feat of wave frequencies and engineering that relied on shoving as much energy as possible into a controlled location. The waves overlapped with a fine medium of uniform material and caused something similar to hundreds of thousands of black holes that fought each other in an unorganized clusterfuck. Space-time was crudely ripped to pieces, forming a shallow tear in the fabric of reality. Then came the calibrations, which were set based on the energy readings and an average of datasets related to what had worked last time. A large metal sphere would then be shot out of the space-age equivalent of a cannon. Pure kinetic trajectory, rapid acceleration. The spheres were all precise and uniform in size. Exactly so, to the point where a standard deviation of 0.001 units would be enough to cause colossal and catastrophic failure. The spheres were recycled for reuse after each trip, due to unavoidable warping during their travels, making it extremely impractical to bother with this for anything but the most important of tasks. Starting from the outside in, the spheres began as a thick ball of pure copper, which covered a slightly smaller sphere of pure aluminum, which covered a slightly smaller layer of lead. Inside that lead was a thick layer of synthetic glass to line a hollow containment, and that was filled with a large amount of heavily oxygenated water. Warp jumping had the negative side effect of absolutely decimating any form of organized information. No matter what storage device the Union had attempted to send, it had been ruined. No type of computer or even solid organized data in set glass or alloy containment would survive unscathed. The information would be scrambled into unrecognizable form. Even the most primitive attempts, such as physical etchings into a sheet of titanium, became distorted. Theories ranged far and wide on why this might be, but the lack of any information to what lay outside the observable universe essentially prevented any advancements from being made. After 400,000 years, it was universally accepted that the only things one could reliably know about warp jumping were where the shot was fired and where it would land. The methods on how it got there instantaneously was anyone's guess. Ruling out computers and any other form of external organized data, there was only one option left to make this strange, archaic, and extremely expensive means worthwhile. Pilots. Yes, warp jumping was a dangerous profession. For some reason, life could survive a warp jump. Of course, how this was originally discovered was something of a black stain in the Union's history books, but nonetheless it was crucial. The unobserved universe would distort any information sent by warp jump, but if a life form was sent through such an event, for reasons not quite known, they would emerge unaffected. Most of the time. Few species could survive the trip, not because of the trip itself, but because the process to create the warp spheres took a significant amount of time, and any life that wanted to make it through the trip had to be sealed within a pool of dense liquid and then surrounded by thick layers of metal. Most species would not only panic at the thought, they would simply drown before the sphere was even completed, which had dramatically lowered the list of potential applicants. Once the physical limitations were applied, the list came down to a select few species of intelligent life. The sheer insanity of it narrowed the list even further. Of all the known species within the Union, there was only one that was both willing and capable of warp jumping. They were known as Gemind. Zyos was one such Gemind. Essentially, he was nothing but a ball of flesh, and only identifiable as male by his genotype. He had no visible features, and basically no variation. He was this way because he chose to be this way, and if he so desired, he could change. Mass was finite, and he could not grow in that regard, but he could shift. Any shape, any time, he was not limited. Granted, he had no bones, so his shifting rarely made much of a difference outside of an aquatic environment, but he could extend himself out to mimic the many nervous system pathways which other species possess. This trait was what had made Geminds considered the most successful and dangerous parasitic species ever known. By using primitive species from their home planet as hosts, Gemind had taken to the stars and encountered the Union. It took hundreds of cycles before the Union was aware of the fact that Gemind were parasites at all, and that their hosts were simply domesticated like livestock for use. The only reason the Union ever became aware of this fact was due to the Gemind's primal and violent urges. To take a new host was a delicious feeling, and such a vast array of other intelligent life was too much for some individuals to resist. Yes, there were more than a few casualties in those early years. Now, of course, such things were considered savage. Outside of those who had completed their full military service to the Union, it was rare that any earned the right to a true host, and those could only be of creatures without true intelligence. Synthetic exoskeletons of many variations could be designed on a whim, but these were a poor substitute for individuals with a true craving. For Zyos, that primal urge never did fade with time. In fact, if anything, it grew stronger every cycle. Zyos was glad he was finally capable of retirement. Each jump he completed, he mentally approached as his last. Now it was a simple game of waiting for the correct motivation, the correct set of encouraging factors to push him to pull the trigger and start a new life. He wanted it to be exceptional. He wanted it to be one of a kind. Occasionally, drifting and restricted subcurrents of thought would wander beneath the surface, like deep undertow on an oceanic world. They could pull him down into daydreams as he wondered what it must be like to take another creature's life and blood as his ancestors did, to feel them as they twitched and pulsed, to intercept and envelop their very mind on the psychic plane, and then as a physical thing, to feel a sexual ecstasy as their muscles tensed and thrashed, and their nerves became numb, until he devoured their brain and took their place, to become them without anyone realizing. The lump of flesh shivered within its confinement. Zyos often found his thoughts wandered in such directions when he was preparing for a warp. Contained in complete darkness, sealed by glass and metal, he was as free from outside influence as was physically possible. The telekinetic links that he constantly shared with his fellow Gemind were gone here, and none could know his individual thoughts but himself. Zyos enjoyed that very much. His fantasies could be imagined here with vivid, gruesome detail, and none would be the wiser for it. Long ago, when the Union had discovered their strange ability, his species had purged the more violent-natured individuals from their ranks. It was a matter of necessity. Remove those few, or lose everyone. The murder of other intelligent species was taboo outside of war or defense of life, and their species had been found guilty on thousands of counts. Their ultimatum was made while staring down the arsenal of entire fleets around their systems, and in the end, it wasn't even a choice at all. The Gemind of that time had come together in groups and focused their mind channels open. As a single unit, they worked with gruesome efficiency. Those they had selected, those who did not fit the ideal mold, were ground into genetically sterile lumps of organic mush through the combined and focused will of psychokinesis. This process lasted for an entire cycle, and afterwards their species was reborn. Not a single incident had occurred since then. Despite this, Zaius suspected that the purge had not been truly successful. Evolution was a difficult thing to overcome, and the forced selection might have only made those individuals with violent urges much harder to detect. Perhaps they had unintentionally pushed their species onto another level, with an extinction event that let only the most deceptive survive. He considered this often, for his nature was simply an asexual clone of the being that came before him, and true matings of his kind were rare. Obviously, something had been missed along the line if he was the way he knew himself to be. If he had slipped undetected through the ranks of his peers, imagine how many others had done it. 400 cycles was a long time to go unnoticed. Certainly too long to have been a fluke. His thoughts were scattered by a sudden impact that slammed his jelly-like texture along the glass lining of his encasement with brutal violence. He willed his form to splay out in panic, to become a thin and loose puddle of skin. The enclosure rocked back again in the other direction as he felt himself slow dramatically. The unceremonious arrival of a warp drive pod was never easy to predict when you were on the inside. As he slowly collected himself, he pulled his thoughts back into cohesion. His urges were suppressed into the dark depths of his mind, and he covered any tracks by means of hundreds of decoys. From the weather on the home planet to military duties, he committed the thoughts to a cycling repetition as he readied for the inevitable embrace of his kin. Already he could feel them reaching towards him as the layers of metal were peeled away from the sphere. These trips had a purpose besides providing him time to plan his retirement into true flesh and the twisted fantasies he wished to make reality. He was a warp jumper, and like all others, he had information to report and vital information to receive. Military secrets and dangerous tides were waiting outside of his shrinking isolation. Echoes, cloaks, and daggers. Perhaps this had been his final jump. He would certainly never find himself bored with this destination. The Fringe was an interesting place, and people seemed to go missing all the time without much explanation. Maybe retirement here wouldn't be so bad. He awoke as the floor shook with an impact that knocked his body airborne. Landing roughly against the metal of the cargo bay floor, the man looked around for a source, but found nothing. He was alone in the cargo hold, and not much had changed in his prospects of freedom. Vaguely, he recalled watching crew members stop on the walkways above to bow and sing as if they were appreciative of something. The human below them had been too exhausted to pay much attention beyond that, and had paid it little mind until now. His head throbbed as he tried to think through his situation. He needed to observe and learn, continue as he had been, stay focused. There were no crew members now, though, which brought his attention to the ship beneath his feet. In the distance there were loud sounds of clanging impacts, which reverberated beneath him. He must have been out for a long time. Perhaps they were landing somewhere. The man rose and began to walk to the center of the bay as he tried to find a better spot for sound to reach him. Though he understood nothing in their speech, he had found he could interpret the emotions behind his strange host's language to some degree, and had very little to do recently but listen for it. He craned his neck to catch any hint of sound while cupping his ear. His ears soon began to hear dissonant songs, and he felt sick to his stomach. These were songs that seemed to emanate fear itself, if they weren't simple screams of terror. Directly under the balcony of the bridge now, he tried to see further down the hallways, and felt frustration begin to build. No matter how he angled himself, he could see nothing at all. In displeasure, he leapt at the walkway's edge and found himself airborne. With a heavy impact, he landed back on the ground, but realization had hit him. The metaphoric light bulb was lit. With all the strength he could muster, he pulled at a crate along the side of the bay. Slowly, inch by inch, it moved until he had what he needed. An angle of attack. Squeezing himself behind the crate with his back to the wall, he pushed with his arms and legs, shoving it off the wall entirely and toward the center of the room. Inch by inch, he pushed the heavy thing a bit farther, until it was finally into a reasonable position. Taking a moment to catch his breath, the man walked to the far back of the room and prepared himself. With a running start, he launched himself at it, jumping and then kicking off again. He flew, soaring through the air until he crashed against the edge of the walkway. His hands scrambled to find adequate grip, but soon after the man pulled himself up. He was free. Standing upon the walkway, vibrations shook his bare feet with steady rhythms of pounding to match the distant sounds. Voices were singing in the distance, and their fear echoed towards him. It felt wrong, very wrong. His feeling of success was tainted by an uneasy itch between his shoulders, an itch that urged him to act, and act now. Soon he was running in leaps and bounds, pushing himself off of walls as he came to them with sudden ricochets through the narrow halls. If something was wrong with the ship, it had a very direct impact on him, and he had no intention of dying if he could do something to stop it. That thought fell from his mind as the human rounded the corner. A group of six-limbed, wart-covered frog creatures stood in his path, and they gurgled to one another in violent discussion. Beneath their 3-digit feet was a dead crew member. A gaping hole in its chest seemed to drip with blue gore. Carnage was evident along the hall, and there were splatters of blood along the ceiling which cast strange glows as their lights flickered on and off. The creatures were tugging at the dead alien with their strange feet, viciously, as if they were trying to rip it into pieces. As he watched, the man felt himself grow ill. Despite his dislike of his captors, none of them had deserved such a gruesome fate. Blood sprayed onto the walls and ceiling as the creatures played a game of tug-of-war with the corpse, promptly ripping the head from its torso. If there was any chance that crew member had still been alive, it was gone now. There was movement in that instant, as another crew member nearby began crawling desperately away from the creatures. Its left leg was leaving a trail of blue blood from a huge gash along its side. A grim face and determined movement hauled it away from the predatory aliens. Its tail wavered in strange tension, which gave off the reminiscent impression of clenching a jaw in pain. The alien was feminine in a similar manner as the caped being with the brace, and her eyes were of a light green. The uniform, though soaked in blue, had been white material. As she crawled, she noticed him. Her song of pain and terror was faint as she turned and crawled in his direction, leaving a sharp angle in the trail of blood behind her as she directed her movements down his side of the forked pathway. It dawned on him that he recognized this alien. Her battered and stained clothing could not hide that voice. This was his nightly visitor. One of the warty creatures shouted and shoved a smaller companion out of its way with multiple limbs. It drew a blade from its back and began to brutally hack into the dead crew member. As the others ripped off pieces, splatters of blood filled the air like rain. With a ferocity that was feral and disgusting, they feasted on the blue gore. They were eating. They were enjoying this. The wounded crew member crawled the entire length of the hall until she reached the man's feet, and her song broke into a simple cry for help. She clutched at his ankles in desperation as she tried to pull herself farther from the beings behind her. Slowly, the human brought himself down to her level and pulled her to lean against the wall of the hallway. Her resistance was minimal at best, unable to do more than grip at his arms. His eyes stayed on the rabid intruders, waiting for movement from their feast. None seemed to come, and the man turned back to the survivor. Close up, her features reminded him of someone. He didn't know who, but he felt they had been important. Her weak cries of pain seemed to bring up a rage which overshadowed anything he had ever remembered feeling before. Despite that he knew she was a being which had assisted in his imprisonment, that she might not even be a she at all, the man found himself strangely attached. Committed. He didn't know or understand any of what had begun here on this ship, but this creature had been the closest thing he had to a friend since arriving on this ship, and that was worth protecting. That was worth more than anything else. He knew commitment, and he knew what it entailed. Falling into a fighting stance, he found himself standing in plain view of the vicious creatures. Slowly he began to stretch his limbs into tight stances. Methodically he felt his joints begin to pop, one after another. As he relished in the feeling of something familiar, he began to flex and straighten into place. The slow bobbing back and forth on his legs, the quickening of the heartbeat, the tension in his arms. These were safe. These were things he had done many, many times before. Though he could not remember when, he knew his legs would react and his fists would land. Perhaps before this he had been a warrior. Recognition bubbled in his mind suddenly. Of course he had done this before. He had protected others. A basic and general memory, but it was directed at him and not his surroundings, and that gave him strength of a different kind. The soles of his feet seemed to glide now, as those lightly bounced movements from foot to foot took little more motion than the force of his toes. He was ready to do what he knew unconsciously but could not recognize. Though he still could not speak, his mind screamed as adrenaline rippled in waves through his flesh. He faced the creatures and prepared to do what he knew to be right. One purpose enveloped him, and he began to do what humans had been mastering for thousands of years before him. He began to wage war.